Welcome to ReligionWise. I'm your host, Chip Gruen. So this month's episode is a re-release, and it's a re-release from a recording we did in 2023 with Dr. Lorenzo Servitje from Lehigh University, who's Associate Professor of English and is active in his research and teaching on issues of public health, and in particular, public health in the humanities. The reason that we wanted to re-release this now in the current context of public life and policy has to do with the way that Dr. Servitje thinks about the world. And in particular, he argues that the thought world, that is the cultural and literary material we live in, the language we use, the stories that we tell, the narratives that take hold, that all of those things are themselves infrastructure. And not just general, generic cultural infrastructure, but also infrastructure for how we think about health, wellness, disease, sickness, and death. And that the framework and the language and the stories that we tell both shape and are shaped by that larger worldview of health, wellness, disease, and death. So when we first talked about this, it was very much in the context of Victorian England, the stories of Frankenstein and Dracula, etc. And it seemed somewhat abstract for the world in 2023. But developments have happened at the federal level, both through legislation and through executive order, that we as a country have chosen to stop funding some things, in particular the National Institutes of Health, National Science Foundation on the science side, and also the National Endowment for the Humanities on the humanities side, that display a shift in worldview, a shift in priorities, a shift, in other words, of the stories we tell and how we tell them around issues of health, wellness, medicine, etc. So some of this is obviously very much an open question. Funding gets cut for an agency, then it gets restored. But beyond all of that, the conversation that we are having, both in public and in government settings, has changed really significantly. And we thought that this particular conversation might sound different given the current situation that we're in, and how health has become an open conversation, or how we think about health has become an open conversation, even if the vast majority of the scientific community's ideas about these things haven't shifted. The public policy angle certainly has. Another part of this is that we'll hear Dr. Servitje talk about language of infection and parasites and swarms, and that though it is related intimately to diseases and health and wellness, that those things can also get attached to people and identities, whether those be national or ethnic or religious or racial. And so we can hear echoes of that Victorian conversation reemerging now, as these are not only conversations about health, but they're also about identities and immigration and minority groups in our world as well. It is regrettable that this conversation ends up being uniquely relevant in new and different ways now, but I hope that you'll listen to it with 2026 ears and hear something that's maybe a little different than what we might have thought about even a few years ago, and thinking really deeply about how humanities conversations about literature and storytelling are deeply embedded in the way that policy happens and the discourse around policy happens, whether that be in stories or Facebook posts or Instagram or Twitter. That the tools of language analysis and thinking about the way that we think about things is relevant and important, and that these humanities tools can help us unpack some of that. Before we start the conversation, you will hear that the occasion for this conversation was actually that Lorenzo Servitje delivered the Wallenberg Tribute Lecture in the same year that this was recorded, in 2023. That is fast upon us. Wallenberg 2026 is coming up this November. We will have, again, a public lecture as well as a banquet that celebrates the year in the Institute. If you are in the Lehigh Valley or are interested in traveling to the Lehigh Valley to attend and learn more about us and be a part of the festivities, we would love to have you here. You can find more information at religionandculture.com and drop us your contact information in our contact link there. Or you can reach out directly at religionandculture@muhlenberg.edu, and we will get an invitation out to you. And finally, we would love to hear from you. We always really enjoy our listener engagement. If you have a reaction, a suggested topic or guest, a comment, a question that you'd like to share with us, we are always gathering those up for future mailbag episodes. Again, you can reach us at religionandculture@muhlenberg.edu or drop us your contact information at religionandculture.com, and we will get back in touch with you. So without further ado, here is Lorenzo Servitje and our conversation on monsters in medicine. What can spooky stories tell us about health and disease? Lorenzo Servitje, thanks so much for being on ReligionWise.
Thank you so much for having me, Chip. I'm very happy to be here.
So let's just jump right in. So if you don't mind, I'd really like to start with intellectual biography. So you have a couple of fields that you're a part of that don't go necessarily together in people's minds. So I'd really love to hear a little bit about the trajectory of your career and this confluence of English literature with public health.
Thank you so much, Chip. I'd be glad to talk about that. I definitely spent a long time and maybe continue to think about like what it is I want to do when I grow up in terms of my intellectual interests. But I can tell you I started off thinking I wanted to go to medical school in undergrad. I was a fitness instructor at the time, trying to do my pre-med recs and majoring in exercise physiology. And I picked up an English major because I always happened to be good at it and I liked it and I always found it fascinating. And as I got closer toward graduation, I was not really sure what I wanted to do and was taking, looking at and starting to practice and taking the MCAT, and then kind of got the idea in my head of maybe just toying with the idea of graduate school in English in case that didn't work out. And as I was finishing my upper division in English requirements, I noticed I started just to write a lot about medical topics in literature, metaphors of disease in fiction from like the Fairy Queen and the Canterbury Tales and even Shakespeare and some romantic fiction. And one of my advisors told me like, hey, there's people that actually study medicine and health in history and literature. So I started looking around at graduate programs near me, and I found a professor, her name is Dr. Susan Ziegler at UC Riverside, who focused on the idea and invention of addiction and the addict in 19th century literature, and sent her an email about, I work at a rehab center. I'm a fitness instructor. I'm really interested in medicine and literature. And so I applied to a number of different programs and I got into that one. And that's how I kind of got into the English graduate degree. And I wasn't really sure what I wanted to study specifically. I knew I was just interested in medical things and health. And I finally eventually settled on the Victorian period and started to look at representations of health and epidemiology and infectious disease. And as my work progressed and I finished my PhD, I became really interested in not just representations of science and literature, but thinking about how humanists, historians, and literary scholars and philosophers could interface and interact with people that work in health, which eventually got me to apply to a master's in public health program. And that's how I really kind of started to drive my intersections in terms of my formal training and intellectual interests.
Yeah, so while you represent this in yourself and in your work, in your scholarship and teaching, that this is part of a larger trend that we can point to. And you mentioned this actually in one of your papers. I'm going to drop a little quote here. In the paper, The Not So Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in Antibiotic Research, you write, recently, there's been an impulse to include humanistic and social scientific dimensions in scientific and biomedical research, yet this is often reduced to the form of a checkbox on a grant application. So on the one hand, there is this nod that this exists, but on the other hand, you seem to indicate that there's a little bit of dissatisfaction in how the rubber meets the road in this kind of interdisciplinary work. So can you talk about sort of the promise of this and maybe the failed start of it in other ways?
Yeah. And I mean, I could say like a lot of this in terms of social science that predates, I think, the inclusion of the humanistic work, where in a lot of NSF grants, for instance, are, I think some NIH grants as well, they would like a social scientist, an anthropologist or a sociologist to do something but recently in terms of a lot of funding internally at my institution and externally, there's been an interest in like, how can you bring these two things together? And whether it's been, STEM and engineering or natural science research, or, even public health or epidemiology, and you want to include some other kind of field, to do that substantively is hard and it takes a lot of, risk and time. And so sometimes, it can be where like, we'll just include you as a co-author on a paper or, like just come and kind of like tell us about your work and like tell us about it and we'll kind of like think about it. And that's kind of like where we're really bridging the inclusion of health humanities and medical humanities or people just in humanistic work that are already coming in on collaborative projects, that are within the sciences or engineering in and of themselves. And so that's kind of like the interdisciplinary merging of medical health humanities, science and literature, and then coming in with, say biology or microbiology or epidemiology or public health or health policy or even engineering, as I've done in actually very productive ways, not this kind of like checkbox ways. Mm-hmm. When it comes to medical humanities and health humanities, a little bit independently of that, it's medical humanities, which has been sort of traditionally defined as the inclusion of humanistic study in medical education and really focused on academic medicine for training medical practitioners. The impulse for that has been around at least since the 70s or 80s, where the increased kind of technologization of health, the increase in what a sociologist of medicine, Adele Clark, calls biomedicalization, or Peter Conrad calls medicalization, where, medicine's starting to take over all these different aspects of life. There's a kind of dissatisfaction in patients kind of becoming objects of knowledge or, kind of just being processed. And medicine had lost its kind of, quote, human side. And so there was this kind of desire to try to reintroduce humanism or the humanistic side of medicine in a very Arnoldian kind of way, kind of like let's introduce like liberal arts, history, philosophy, literature. And so the idea was if you reintroduce these things into the medical curriculum, poetry and history of medicine and philosophy, that medical practitioners will become more, liberally humanist, and more empathetic. And then that sort of progressed into in the 90s and early 2000s, where beyond just kind of including it, thinking really substantively of, well, what does this really mean? And, are we doing more than just like trying to inculcate empathy by having, practitioners or medical students read poems about patients with strokes and things like that, and started to become like really its own field of research, where we're really thinking about, well, what does it mean to do work about medicine and medical practice from a humanistic perspective? And it sort of shot off in a couple of different directions. One became narrative medicine, that was developed by a PhD MD out of Columbia named Rita Sharon. And that's really looking at understanding literary theory, literary close reading at a very, very high level, and applying that to medical practice and developing interpersonal patient skills, shared decision making, and really like in a very substantive way, interpersonal and professional reflexive practices that help, create better doctors, better patient experiences. And, as she argues, and I definitely would see that there's a case, and there's studies on this, that it produces better diagnoses. Like, you can catch things because you can help understand patients' illness narratives and stories beyond just their signs and symptoms and disease states. So that's like narrative medicine, and that's really practice oriented. Health humanities sort of started to be theorized as an expansion beyond medical humanities and beyond medicine, to really think about not just the clinic and doctors, but other allied health professionals and health and other dimensions of health that aren't necessarily just related to the clinic and the provider. So this starts to include physical therapy, nursing, pharmacy, and even beyond that, public health, and then even more broadly than that, and inclusive of public health, the different drivers and conditions that shape people's health beyond just access or experience with healthcare and healthcare delivery. So health humanities is much broader, and definitely isn't just focused on medicine per se. Like, you won't see in a venue or a conference that's really focused on medical humanities, there's much less about doctor-patient, and there's more about, people's experience in the community relative to harm reduction strategies or public health interventions, or things like studies of wellness and what does wellness culture mean. And to that, I would probably add one more way to discretize the field, at least in terms of my training as a literary scholar originally. We could talk about literature and medicine as a related, but can also be a discrete thing. So part of the way I'm thinking about this is the different journals that exist. So we have Journal of Medical Humanities, there's health humanities journals, literature and medicine is one very specifically. And that's one I'm really identify with, because it's really interested in focusing on thinking about works that can both focus on literature, on health and medicine in literature, and it can be ultimately of value and about the literature itself, or it could go the other direction and think about well, here's this object, and what does it tell us about this either historical or contemporary understanding about literature and health. So the research quotient or the conclusion or the implication of the work can be more relevant to the people working in the humanities side, or it could be relevant to those that are more interested on the health side. So a lot of this, and in terms of the fields, and a lot of people can split hairs and like to take hard stances on this, but a lot of this I think comes down to publication and what the kind of venue is. If you're teaching, are you teaching in a medical school? Are you teaching in a health sciences school? Are you teaching in an undergrad institution? That's where sometimes these discretations and kind of nominalizations, I think, make a difference. But I think it is important. And I think likewise, there are a lot of incentives for funding these, and there's a lot of excitement and institutions like it. And I think some of the funding agencies that are not just in the humanities, so things beyond the NIH, want to try to do this. But it's, often difficult to find a good mix because, how are you going to bring you back just a quick example of the Jekyll and Hyde article that I published in the Journal of Antibiotics. That was a really unique experience in this case because it was the first time I had a paper that had 4 external peer reviewers. In literary studies and history, we often get 2. But, I suggested a bunch of different reviewers, but I could really tell that at least one reviewer was very well trained in Victorian studies and science. One reviewer was clearly trained in the history of medicine. 2 other reviewers were clearly coming at it from a clinical and biomedical angle. And, were making comments on my definitions of virulence and pathogenicity and other ones about antibiotics. So that was a really, really unique experience. And it was probably one of the most generative publication experiences I've had in terms of revising. So that actually ended up being really cool and a really neat intersection of how I think this could work in an ideal situation. But it's hard to do in practice, especially if you're pulling work and trying to find a bunch of different experts in related fields, maybe coming from different disciplines, but experts enough to talk about a topic and then like judge something, whether it be a publication or a grant application, and say like, yes, we should do this. So it's fun and exciting. It's like a great time for this, but it doesn't operationally, doesn't always execute well just because it's hard.
Yeah, I wonder, being a professor at a liberal arts place, right? The Institute for Religious and Cultural Understanding is embedded as a part of Muhlenberg College. And so we teach undergraduates, and I have lots of people who are going into medical fields. And one of the things I always like to tell them is working on a person, right? Doing healthcare for a person is not the same as changing the oil in a car, right? That there is a certain amount of sort of cultural fluency that is necessary. Some of those things that you describe as humanistic. And I wonder, as health humanities develops or medical humanities develops, and you see the introduction in curricula of courses like history of medicine or things that are topically, seem really, really relevant, right, to somebody who would be interested in pursuing medicine as a career. But you could also imagine another scenario where somebody says, you know what, being broadly trained in the liberal arts, in human culture is important too. So what is the back and forth or the current state of the conversation about that, hey, let's build humanities curricula that are intended to be, for those people who are interested in medical fields, as opposed to, hey, being broadly educated can help in lots and lots of different ways, some of which are not predictable.
That's a great and excellent point. And I think one of the trends in health and medical humanities that speaks to that is the growth of health humanities and health medicine and society programs like the one at Lehigh or medicine, health and society at Vanderbilt that are introducing this as a major in the undergraduate curriculum. And again, like that works really well for people that are going into medicine, but not necessarily. And that sort of kind of like, on the one hand, fixes a problem where, look, it's really hard to like put more things into the medical school curriculum, especially like, I would love to teach a class where I have like third year, fourth year medical students read Middlemarch, but like, no way, is that going to happen? They don't have the time, and totally get it. And, by introducing this at the undergraduate level, like we do develop that kind of broader sensibility and broader interdisciplinary and, liberal arts kind of thinking for people that are like already kind of primed, that think they want to do something in health. And a lot of them go on to medical school or different professional schools like PA school. But we also increasingly see students, and have written a lot of like successful letters of recommendation for students that have gotten into master's in public health programs, students that go to work in industry. And I mean, I have to tell you, I kind of don't hate the idea of somebody who's going to be an actuary or a claims adjuster, or somebody at, evil insurance company, evil medical insurance company, or not so great health insurance company being trained in this and already having that kind of sensibility. I mean, that seems to be like a way to introduce this kind of thinking back into like all these different facets and industries and, large stakeholder institutional and corporate apparatuses that affect our health that aren't just like the clinic. And if we have people that are going into that workforce and are trained in liberal arts, are broadly trained, whether it is through a more focused like health humanities, health medicine society curriculum or not, or it's something that could be history and or liberal arts or religious studies that is able to provide that kind of broad context for critical thinking and contextualization and, not to circumscribe other disciplines or majors to purely technical training. But I think that's one positive benefit that I start to see reflected in the growth of these kind of programs and popularity of these majors at the undergraduate level.
Yeah. So, okay. So that's the field, right? So let's dig down a little bit into your work. And I've had such a great time over the last several weeks as we've been talking about doing this interview, reading a lot of your work and thinking about the things that you're thinking about. And so much of that work, much of your publications spring from the Victorian period, a period, by the way, that I also find endlessly fascinating, and maybe I will have the chance to editorialize on why I find that as
I would
fascinating
love
as
to hear
well.
one. Yeah.
But can you talk a little bit about what drew you to this period and why this period seems so so pregnant and useful for your work?
Yes, and can I be completely honest? I did not go into the Victorian period as my PhD because I loved Victorian literature. I had actually, I mean, I don't think I read any Victorian literature in my undergraduate degree. I read like Dracula and Jane Eyre in like high school and never liked it. I avoided taking a Dickens class my first year of graduate school. I mean, I was very influenced by my advisor, who was Victorianist, Dr. Zunziger, who wrote the book on the invention of the attic. But I ended up choosing the Victorian period because, I mean, I was interested in medical things, and I was like, well, if I have to pick a historical period for my PhD, I want to pick the one that's most interesting in terms of medical history. And to me, that was the Victorian period. I mean, that's where we see, the development of the profession, medicine as a profession in its kind of modern inflection. You see the development of epidemiology, the development of microbiology, pharmacology, anesthesia. I mean, there's so many interesting medical developments, particularly likewise also for my work in terms of public health, the intersections of health and medicine in the state that don't always take the form of public health as such, but we might theoretically talk about it as an emergence of biopolitics if we're thinking about it theoretically, but really thinking about how different state-driven and political and economic determinants kind of are defining, shaping, and refining population. That really starts to become, as Foucault would say, like a technique or a tool of governance. So that those are the different things that really informed my decision to study the Victorian period. And, when you look at authors like Dickens that were so interested in thinking about the ideas of, not just individual people and types of people as they're, treated and mistreated in this machine of modernity that's urbanization and industrialization. I mean, but he's likewise very much thinking about population. There's a fabulous book I should plug called Populating the Novel by Emily Steinmeier at Penn, which just talks about this idea of population and the novel. So those are the really kind of ideas that made me think like, okay, like I'm going to go with the Victorian period, even though like I don't love Victorian literature and I was a little bit intimidated by it. But I ended up growing to love it, but it was really still driven by, the history.
That's interesting. So my next question is going to be about Gothic literature, but before I get to that, I want to sort of, I don't know, as a non-specialist on this Victorian period, but a period I'm super interested in.
Yeah.
I've always found it just fascinating because you have two things, it seems to me, going on simultaneously. One is what you're talking about, sort of the emergence of sort of the taking root of some of those Enlightenment scientific ideas, right, in the rise of particular technologies or methodologies for thinking about the world, as you so eloquently said about population, about healthcare, and all of those sorts of things developing. So we get, all of this great technological advancement in the world's fairs and, all of this, stuff that is going on, and people are very excited. It's a period of great anticipation and hope for the future, of course, brought to an end by World War I, because we realized all that technology could be used for bad purposes as well. But then at the exact same time, you have the emergence of, for lack of a better term, spiritualist movements, right? People thinking about continuities of life and death. And while we might think about those as being diametrically opposed, the Victorian mind thinks of those as being very closely related to one another, right? The idea that, oh, wait a minute, we can maybe use these new devices to figure out ways of communicating, with people who have passed.
Photograph them and measure them, do different, is it like electromagnetism? Are we measuring changes in heat? Of course there's the doctored photography, but at least the attempts and the interest and the investment to try to be like, yes, there are, these extra supernatural things, but like they don't have to be diametrically opposed. And, even if, the science didn't ultimately end up, substantiating some of the things, like, the interest and the effort was there, and like the excitement was there. And it was really interesting to see that, like, can we use science to kind of like start to capture what is beyond science? And I think likewise also there was, like, in the same way we saw, romanticism in the, late 1700s and early 1800s, kind of as a reaction against, rationalism and Enlightenment thinking. I think likewise there is an element of the supernatural and, supernaturalism, the occult, and, different kinds of fiction and aesthetics as well at the end of the 19th century that were invested in interest in, like, very explicitly pushing back against, the rationalism and the quote progress of science.
Yeah, so let's talk about, so that brings us to Gothic literature, right? And the idea of the Gothic. So let's talk about that, and in what ways the Gothic overlaps the Victorian, and what ways does it sort of root itself or find a home in some of those Victorian sensibilities? Because here, this gets us into the conversation I think that both of us love as well, about monsters, about the occult, about the things that are less well explained.
I mean, it's such a great question, and it's really one that I think works really well in the classroom, and likewise, I think it remains to be a rich field of inquiry for research. And I also have to plug in at Lehigh, at my institution, we have Dawn Keatley. She's a horror studies scholar. Probably one of the most, if not, I would say one of the most renowned in the world. And she does contemporary horror, but a lot of it is still invested and, rooted in this idea of the Gothic in its modern inflections. So I would just like to say it, like, the Gothic doesn't remain to be like just a very historicized thing. It's a very exciting, contemporary field. But to go with your question, I mean, as we often think about the Gothic as either like an aesthetic mode or a genre that's super heavily studied in of itself, I mean, we can definitely see it as emerging from the late 18th century with, things like the Castle of Montrado and, the Mysteries of Udolpho and Matthew Lewis's The Monk as the kind of key Gothic texts that start to move into the Romantic and period in the early 1800s. And we have some very key identifiable tropes that we see in those, the labyrinth, out of the way castles, decaying kind of aristocracies, the entrapped woman, haunting, some kind of curse from the past, secrets. And as we see those kind of like take different forms in the early 1800s and start to shift away from decaying landscapes and away from like things that are old, archaic. I mean, you still start to see the remnants of that in, Mary Shelley, for instance, that is still very heavily influenced by Romanticism and the Gothic as such. When we start to move into the Victorian period, that is very much defined by, things that are kind of in opposition to that, but not exactly, like urbanization and industrialization. I mean, as a result of those, since you do see so much urbanization, industrialization, you start to see the decline of the aristocracy literally as a class. I mean, you absolutely get like decaying castles that no longer can be like upkept. And that creates like a lot of occasions in later on sensation fiction for plot devices. But as we move into the later 19th century and what we might think of as late Victorian or urban Gothic, rather than having, an out of the way landscape or a castle or a moor as the setting, I mean, you're really looking at the same kind of tropes of like decay and filth and curse and occlusion and secrets and kind of like the past having a stranglehold on the present, but the landscape changes to like the city. And this is where we do see things like to like the city and the streets, the factory, the crowds, pollution. You see this in things like Dorian Gray and Jekyll and Hyde and Dracula, although that one kind of jumps back and forth in both modes, which is one of the reasons it's a great text. But, likewise, Jekyll and Hyde, and even in some, late weird and horror fiction, like Arthur Machen, which again also kind of harkens back to the past. But really, like, you try to see the same the same kind of modes of terror, horror, dread, the unknown, doppelgangers, madness, women being taken away and like enclosed and jailed and having to like escape these labyrinth structures, but they're just like not castles and not archaic landscapes, but they take place in like another form that's become taken the same kind of properties that we saw in the Gothic, but again through the engine of modernity. So it's really about like I would say much of the late Victorian Gothic is about the haunting and decay and monstrosity of the engines of modernity.
Yeah, so you mentioned monstrosity, which sort of leads us into where I want to go next, is that we get all of these really, fantastic monsters that emerge. And as you say, from early on, we get some of these emerging in the earlier 19th century, but then moving on into your Victorian period as well, ghost ghouls and fiends of all kinds. Can you talk a little bit about the presence of the monster and how you see that monster functioning in this world?
Yeah, absolutely. So, well, in the earlier Romantic Gothic and earlier 19th and late 18th century Gothic, there's still much of the supernatural at work. And by the late Victorian Gothic, I mean, you definitely do have like the supernatural there, but much of the supernatural can be explained through science. So like Jekyll and Hyde, for example, is a great example where you do have like a monster and you have a kind of supernatural creation of a monster, but like it has a scientific explanation. And in that way, often these kind of monsters are explained likewise through fears of the progress of science and what that entails. You can see that as early as Frankenstein, but you absolutely see this later on. Dr. Moreau, a bunch of other tales and beyond scientific romances and horror fiction of H.G. Wells. Certainly by the early 20th century, things like by Lovecraft. And likewise, there's a couple of other like less well-known ones, but ones that are really using the Gothic mode to villainize scientists and doctors. And a lot of this is informed by one kind of like the fear of experimental science and experimental physiology that was developed in the late 19th century, as defined by a famous French physiologist named Claude Bernard, who started kind of the practice of vivisection. And so this is when they were doing autopsies of live animals because they wanted to help try to understand. And I think this is the quote from Bernard in his book. He says, we need to create experiments of destruction because in order to understand nature, we need to destroy her. And the idea was like, you need to keep these animals alive and you need to like create pathology without like anesthesia or anything like that, except of course they had no problems using paralytics. But, and this is again a nice intersection with Gothic tropes of poisoning and stuff, but that was a way to kind of like, we need to understand nature in its purest form. And there were a lot of politics and reaction. I mean, in fact, the SPCA developed in response to like vivisection. And in fact, anti-vivisection was very tied to first wave feminism. And even, people like John Stuart Mill. So you get in a lot of fiction, vivisectionist physicians and researchers as these uber villains that are like not only doing horrible experiments to animals, but they're like killing people. So for instance, there's this one book that's not very well known that I wrote about called Saint Bernard's Romance of the Medical Students. That's really kind of a collection of a small kind of subgenre of late Victorian Gothic fiction where it's really villainizing medical students because there was just a lot of anxiety about them as like one being like by this point, very rowdy, especially like in like, the city, the London colleges, and them taking like body parts home and like playing tricks on their landladies and things like that, but also becoming like hyper desensitized and dehumanized by their exposure to the anatomy lab. And, there's often very, villainous instructors and researchers there that are doing very dubious things for research that are, again, harkening back to things early in the 19th century, like the Burke and Hare events of trying to, where one Scottish doctor named Robert Knox hired these two criminals to be resurrection men. And secure bodies. But when the supply of bodies ran out, like there weren't enough dead bodies, they just started killing people. And that's how they were supplying it. So like that kind of anxiety like re-emerges, even though they developed laws to kind of forestall that in problematic ways. You still get Robert Louis Stevenson writing about this later on in the century in the short story, the Resurrectionist, or the Body Snatcher, I believe it's called. So like these are definitely some monsters that are like where you kind of get, the mad scientist or the scientist as villain. But, likewise, we still have, Dracula, or, I should also add Dr. Moreau to that one, because that's an important one, particularly in the rise of evolution and degeneration and eugenics and vivisection. But likewise, you also get Dracula in 1897, which is like such a great text because on the one hand, it's got so much of the archaic and antiquity and, earlier Gothic things from like pre-modern worlds. But then on the other half, like it's heavily technologized. There's telegraphs and phonographs and blood transfusions, which were ahead of the game. You have chloroform and chloral hydrate, electric lights. And Dracula is really interesting because, as Halberstram defines him in this great article called Technologies of Monstrosity, he's defined as like an amalgam of all that is other. So it's just a stand-in for so many things like immigration, degeneration, and like, the way that England is declining in the face of all of its like imperial and colonial conquest, reverse colonization. I mean, you can pick a dozen different like salient cultural anxieties of British culture, and you can find an element of them in Dracula as a monster. And that's like one of the reasons it's such a pivotal text that like kind of never seems to lose relevance. I mean, you kind of can't like beat that undead horse to death, I think.
Yeah. So I want to sort of follow up here a little bit because it sounds, as you're describing Dracula, I mean, it's this fascinating, complicated, right, text because it seems to have this foot in a couple different worlds or a couple different
times and worlds, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, being somebody who's primarily interested in religion, one of the ways I've thought about Dracula is it's this old thing that will not die, right? That you can't escape from, that you can't get away from. And so that other can be described, as you say, reverse colonization, right? This is coming from Eastern Europe, that this is aristocratic, right? That we're trying to get away from. But I wonder also if it's not something about like superstition, right? And included in that superstition is the idea of institutionalized religion as well.
Absolutely. I mean, there's definitely like a lot about superstition, and that's one of the things that's so scary, at least for the beginnings of the Crew of Light, where they have to draw on Van Helsing, who seems to be this great interdisciplinarity, who has a foot in both worlds, right? In medical science. But, it's one of those people that has like 9 degrees in spiritualism. And, while he's like one of the heroes of the text, at the same time, he's very like brusque, very much like contra British sensibilities into the things that they have to do in order to like eliminate this monster. And so there's like, even, not just Dracula himself, who again, embodies some of these old world things, that include like religion and, let's say like blood lineage and that kind of thing, the focus on land and markers of class and status, very much tied to older aristocratic and kind of feudal modes. But at the same time, Dracula is also super well versed in like modernity. He knows the train times, like knows the logistics of travel, very much like capitalizes on like, the British desire to like globalize that to be able to like get in where he needs to get in. But at the same time, like, the way to, combat Dracula, they still have to use these technologies of modernity. But at the same time, they have to like rely on Mina, who, is infected by this vampirism and has this telepathic connection with Dracula and kind of knows. It's really interesting. It's this very kind of like espionage kind of like plot where she's, a little bit double agent-ish. And they have to rely on that and utilize that and those like existing supernatural things, in concert with like the tools of modernity that Dracula is utilizing. So it's this interesting contest between both forces, drawing on, the tools and like, power, different kind of modes of power from different time periods and different worlds at the same time to resist each other. So like just the clash of the temporality in those modes and how they're related to different kinds of institutional investments, whether they be, religious or folklore or mythic or, science and modernity and technology. They just consistently clash in the most fascinating of ways. I mean, even like the form of the novel itself, it's an epistolary novel that again has is an older tradition, still shows up in the late Victorian period, but you might think of that as a 18th century, something in the late 18th century or early 19th century, like Frankenstein, for instance. But at the same time, it's like I'm forgetting the scholar's name who wrote this fabulous article called A Parasite for Sore Eyes, that he talks about it is very much like proto-modernism and its pastiche of like not just different like media forms, but genres, and you get telegraphs and just, the composition of itself like is also likewise fluttered with contradiction. And so like in so many ways, it's a text of an antiquated time, but also ahead of its time.
Which, I mean, it fits the period so well, right?
It does.
I mean, that's just exactly it. Going from the stories themselves to the receptions of those stories, right? Or how they're understood. I mean, I can imagine somebody out there saying, no, I loved Dracula when I was 12 years old, and what are you doing to it, right? Like that this isn't about all of this cultural anxiety, that this is just a fun story about a supernatural creature. But clearly, right, that there is a whole field and there's so much, as we said, it's so pregnant with all of these other meanings, right, with all of these entailments to it. And so are those put there, right? Do you see this as the mad genius of the authors sort of imagining the world around them, encapsulating in an allegory, encapsulating in metaphor? Or is this sort of just seeping out because it is part of the culture that they're sort of soaking in and it can't help but come out? How do you see and think about, the role of the author when we start getting into these really, when we're looking at these things 100 years later and finding so much in them?
That's a great question. It really kind of speaks to, in particular, different debates and modes of research and theoretical approaches in literary studies, especially, after the 70s. And, with, theorists like Foucault and Barthes and this idea of the death of the author, where, we started to become a little bit less interested in what the author intended. And I mean, for some good reasons, because evidentiary wise, that's very hard to prove. I mean, without a ton of textual criticism and biographical criticism and notes and manuscripts and things like that, which certainly still is a viable mode of making those kind of claims. And Dracula is an interesting one for that, because there are you can definitely see notes. You have his brother was a neurologist. And so you actually, there's a lot of textual and evidence of him as a writer where he's bringing in these different medical themes, around color and disease. He grew up after his mother having a really horrific experience during one of the cholera epidemics in Ireland, and that was heavily influential to him. And it's he writes about it in relationship to not just Dracula, but one of his other short stories called The Invisible Giant, I believe. And, in the book as well, there's a ton of very explicit, undeniable medical references that are hard to say are just there, William Harvey and Claude Bernard and John Bernard Sanderson, people of the period talking about experimental physiology and germ theory. And I can also say that, the idea of infectious disease in Dracula is very maps on super well to the changing understandings of infectious disease, because Dracula himself is at once this mist. He's associated with pollution and corruption and noxious air and kind of miasma. And so that's an older mode, but at the same time, he's this contagious agent that's not really defined as such, almost like a poison. So that's a pre-germ theory kind of contagionism. And then finally, at the same time, the way he reproduces has very much the elements and the language of germ theory. And to add to that, the way he's described to as a parasite, models the development of parasitology in the late 19th century. And So you have those kind of, elements in there that we could say like, yes, there are like elements of like, within the author's life and periods in writing that kind of give us, evidence to make claims about why there is health and medical relevance in this text beyond just like, this interesting monster. But at the same time, just the as you were mentioning, the period kind of very much informed by new historicism, where we do see texts as products of, their cultural and historical context, and try to understand what's going on historically in other documents and other periods and other archives, and see how they make cross references. And so when you look at the language of infectious disease and tropical medicine and public health and like germ theory as it's understood both in biomedical prose and scientific publication, but also in things like, all year round and the review of reviews and just kind of general periodical press, like the language of, fighting disease and infection as like this aggregate growth thing, or as this like kind of single embodied agent, in the way that Dracula is described as they're fighting against him. And he's also talked about as a disease and as a replicating agent and as an infection. Like, I think there's a lot of evidence, and I'm just speaking to my particular case, but it's the same with other sorts of readings, where you can see how, the descriptions of the text resonate with other kind of idioms, and whether they be metaphors or particular references or allusions. And then likewise, when you see the way Dracula and other texts start to show up, not only in biomedical prose like a couple of years later, but later on, or the way that scientists and doctors and people that are writing about different medical health topics, or another topic, if studying health and medicine isn't your field, but you're looking at economics or something like that, likewise you can start to see in the period and then years afterwards how those texts are either referenced either just like in passing, or as an allusion, or as a metaphor, or just as a rhetorical device. I mean, you can see them seeping in and influencing the culture themselves. So there's that element of bidirectionality that likewise I think allows us to make these kinds of cases. I hope that answers that question.
No, that's great. So I just want to follow up with it. And I know our time is running to a close here. So I want to follow up with just the so what question, right? So you and I can sit and have this super interesting conversation, right? We're both fascinated by some of the same materials, right? Some of the paradox or irony that is built into these things, and it becomes a great opportunity to have a good conversation and to find interest in this. But at the same time, I think the argument that you make and the argument that your field makes is that this is actually important, right? That this is important to the contemporary world in thinking about how these cultural mechanisms work, right? The thinking about what the relationship is between the medical, between the scientific, and between this more amorphous cultural, literary, context in which we live, and that understanding that relationship is not only interesting, but is useful for us and something that we really need to pay attention to. Can you give that case for me?
Yes, I can. I can think of one like particular example. I wrote this short piece for Medical Anthropology and Science and Technology Studies online publication called Somatosphere, which is fabulous. I like my piece, but I think the publication is fabulous. Everybody should see it. And in there, I'm sort of talking a little bit about the language of the war on COVID during that moment. And there's a couple of lines, for instance, where I'm like finding resonance in the way, Donald Trump was like speaking about the China virus, and the way that this, the language of infection and like stamping out and controlling and pushing out, and this really militaristic, pejorative framing of not just a disease, but association of disease with people and particular groups of people was almost like, it was uncannily. I mean, there's a couple of quotes in there where I do this piece. I'm like, look at these like 4 quotes. Like, is this the Crew of Light? Is this Van Helsing, or is this like Donald Trump? And there's a couple where it sounds like very, very close and resonant to each other, just to give you one case. But what I would suggest is that many of these structures and thinkings, especially the ones that can be problematic and ultimately cause harm, in terms of the language and figurations we use to describe other people through lenses of either medicalized racism or xenophobia that, are kind of couched in some sort of like quasi-science or characterization that like is thinking of these of other people as being like harmful, as like swarms, as parasites. I mean, there's like easy associations with this and World War II and Nazi Germany. But what I like to try to tell my students and what I like to think about, it's like, we can see these things as products of their time and understand them as being problematic and representing kind of problematic structures that are not equitable and definitely reflecting things that we now recognize as problems and issues of the past. But likewise, the way we can see them, I think that also provides an opportunity for us to reflect on how, okay, maybe the precise thing that's being critiqued here, like very specifically, isn't the thing that's going on now, but the way of thinking or the structure or the way it's using language and figuration and narration, or the way it's like just it's being used itself as a kind of placeholder, like still operates today. I mean, the way we still use, in contemporary movies, I mean, just think about like James Bond movies that I think a lot of us like, and even, the newer ones. I mean, we can't get away from having disability and deformity as being a marker of villainy, visually speaking. I mean, that's like an old kind of trope. And like, we can think about that now, but I mean, we could also think about how like, look, this has been a thing since like the beginning of the Gothic, and it remains a thing. And yes, it serves a purpose in cinema and, cultural productions, but why are we still invested in that? And why is that still such a utilizable and capturable aesthetic mode that works in cinema? And what does that tell us? So the way that we can trace some of the things that remain from the period, and I think is one way that they're still useful. And likewise, we can think also a bit counterfactually and say we use these texts almost like a theoretical apparatus and a framework to think about where we are now. And, my work on antimicrobial resistance, for instance, help us. I mean, I can make a historical case about how Dracula has a role to play in the development of the overuse of antibiotics through the kind of war of infectious disease. But, we could also think about the way, the War of the Worlds or other texts like, while they might not be about something contemporary like antimicrobial resistance in 2023, do provide us a way to think about our kind of anthropocentric way of thinking in relationship to ourselves and other kinds of life, especially through a kind of colonizing impulse. So, I mean, I think there's a way that we can use them historically to trace structures and lineages. And I think likewise, they can also be used as, a kind of frame or kind of lenses to help analyze our own period or something we see in the present that we might not so readily or easily see without something that's like just defamiliar enough to be able to kind of like just give us another perspective. I hope that answers that question.
I think it absolutely does. And I think that is a good place for us to leave it today. So thank you, Dr. Lorenzo Servitje, for being with us here on ReligionWise. This has been great.
You're welcome. Thank you so much, Chip.
This has been ReligionWise, a podcast produced by the Institute for Religious and Cultural Understanding of Muhlenberg College. ReligionWise is produced and directed by Christine Flicker. For more information about additional programming, or to make an inquiry about a speaking engagement, please visit our website at religionandculture.com. There, you'll find our contact information, links to other programming, and have the opportunity to support the work of the Institute. Please subscribe to ReligionWise wherever you get your podcasts. We look forward to seeing you next time.